Hi students, welcome to week 8 of Bio 11, Evidence of Evolution. So we've probably all heard about evolution, but what exactly is it? It's the process by which organisms are related by common descent. So what does this mean? This means that all organisms can trace their lineage back to the very first cells that arose in history. Remember, we learned about cell theory where all cells arise from other cells. So this should make sense. So we know that because we have recombination during meiosis, over time, the genomes passed on by organisms are able to change. Because of these changes, groups of organisms can change over time because the ones that have traits most suited to their natural environment are able to basically have more babies. So therefore, their genetic traits take up a larger proportion of the population. So evolution takes place over long periods of time because it takes many, many generations of offspring for organisms to change significantly. So how can we as humans who live less than 100 years study this? Well, we've learned a tremendous amount of information from fossils and the fossil record. So about 100 years ago, 200 years ago, there was a huge explosion of scientists digging up and looking for fossils. This is around the time that Charles Darwin also published his thesis on the origin of species. And if you really want to fall down an incredible internet rabbit hole, Google the Great Dinosaur Rush. It was just a ridiculous war of egos of scientists in the 1800s trying to find these dinosaur bones. It's amusing. We can also look, you look at these fossils and look at the anatomy of these organisms that lived millions of years ago. We can also look at the anatomy of living organisms and how they resemble each other today, especially as they develop from the earliest embryos. And then we also have molecular evidence of evolution because we're able to study how gene sequences change over time. So a little bit more about fossils. I mentioned the fossil record. So fossils are the physical evidence of organisms that lived in ancient times as opposed to those that live in modern times. So generally these are bones because soft tissues decompose pretty rapidly over time, but we can leave the calcified bones behind. There are also fossils which are basically animals that became stuck in rock, and you can see the imprint of the animals that were stuck there even though their bodies have decomposed. So in your lab manual, you have something known as the time scale. This is an important table for you to learn. And the way to read this table is from the bottom, which represents the beginning of geological time on Earth, to the top, which it represents the modern era. And it divides history into eras, periods, and epochs based on important events in evolutionary history. So some of the very important events you will see are many mass extinction events that have occurred over time. So you're probably most familiar with the extinction event that caused the die-out of the dinosaurs, but these events have happened several times over history. So these events are defined as when a large number of species disappear in a relatively short, geologically speaking, amount of time. So this basically means about a few million years. So this is important because we've seen these mass extinction events happen in history, and a lot of scientists believe that we're in the middle of a mass extinction event right now. So here's a version of the time scale, which is very similar to the one in your manual. Because of the technology of radioisotope dating, like carbon dating, we're able to detect how old a specific rock layer or fossil actually is. And by examining the patterns of fossils that existed at different times in history, scientists have been able to create a timeline of evolutionary events in the Earth's 4.5 billion year lifetime. So our manual has a listing of some of the major events which have led to the evolution of all the different animal groups that we know and love today: the fish, amphibians, reptiles, mammals, and also the hominid species like humans. So scientists who study comparative anatomy to study evolution will compare different parts of organisms. So as you see in this image from your manual, the bones of our human arms have pretty striking similarities to the bones in the appendages of other animals, like the legs of horses, turtles, and frogs, and the flippers of whales, and the wings of a bird. These parts are said to be homologous if they exhibit similar basic structures and embryonic origins. So there are different groupings of bones in our arm and our hand. So from the shoulder to the elbow, we have the humerus bone. From the elbow to the wrist is the radius and the ulna. Then we have the carpals and the metacarpals, which make up the wrists and the hands. And then finally, the phalanges are the bones of the fingers. So you can see these in the color chart that the other vertebrate animals have these bones as well, in comparable groupings of bones, but they have changed over time, over the evolutionary history. So if you look at the bones of the bat, you can very easily see a hand-like shape in there, but the phalanges are just very thin, and the metacarpals are very thin to allow the bat to fly. And also you can see the dolphin. The dolphin has a humerus and a radius and ulna, but they're very shortened to resemble the flipper that the dolphin has. So developmental biologists can study embryological development of animals to trace the origins of different tissues and organs. So all animal embryos resemble each other in the early stages of development, and then eventually embryos begin to develop their own unique patterns, which resemble the fully developed organisms that we recognize. So here you can see the embryos of fish, salamander, turtle, chick, pig, cat, rabbit, and human. And you can see they all kind of start out looking like shrimp cocktail, and then they eventually develop their different traits as they go through embryologic development. So bone morphology is something that is also compared in addition to looking at the different tissues. So you may have heard the oft-repeated fact that chimpanzees are the closest living evolutionary relative to humans according to genetic content. We also have very similar skeletal structures, but we have slight differences due to the adaptations to our different habitats. So chimpanzees live in forested habitats and are very adept at climbing and moving through trees. Humans, we don't live in trees, we live in houses, and we're adapted to walking on 2 feet. So as a result, the head, the torso, the spine, femur, knee joint, and the feet are all similar but slightly different in chimpanzees and humans. So if you note, the position of the spine in a chimpanzee, which is able to walk with its forearms, is very different to the position of the spine in humans. And then the size and the shape and the position of the pelvis is also different in chimpanzees and humans to also help enable this stance. The skulls of humans and chimpanzees are also similar but different. The most obvious difference is if you look at the parietal bone and the frontal bone, these are very large to accommodate the much larger human brain. So we have brains that are larger relative to our body size compared to chimpanzees. And another difference is the supraorbital ridge. So supraorbital means above the orbit. It's the ridge above the eye. So in humans, you can look where basically our eyebrows are. We have a slight ridge there compared to the chimpanzee, which has a very prominent supraorbital ridge over their eye. So finally, we have our molecular evidence of evolution. So you should be pretty convinced now. In addition to the fossil record and studies of comparative anatomy, we can also add in biochemical and molecular studies to the evidence for evolution. So we're able to sequence entire genomes, meaning that the entire genetic content of an organism is sequenced, and we're able to compare something referred to as sequence homology. So this is how similar the genetic sequences are. Sometimes we can't find an exact match by DNA sequence, but we're also able to compare amino acid sequences. So amino acids are the building blocks of proteins, and they also have a sequence to build these proteins. So based on the amount of homology, either in the DNA sequence or the protein sequence, we're able to map how closely related organisms are using something called a phylogenetic map, which is pictured here. So this map shows the degrees of relatedness of different organisms based on the DNA sequence of the gene for cytochrome C, which is an important gene required for the mitochondria to function. So as you look at this map, you can see that we're closely related to monkeys, a little bit less closely related to dogs and horses, but all the way on the right, you can see the purple branches showing the yeast. So we're sort of related to yeast, but not very much. So because we also have protein similarities, we're able to have similar reactions in immune systems. So antibodies, which I'm sure we've all heard about due to the COVID-19 pandemic, antibodies are proteins that are produced by the immune system, which react specifically to foreign substances known as antigens. So on antigens, there's a specific sequence known as an epitope, which is recognized by the recognition sites on the antibody. So antibodies may recognize similar antigens in other species, depending on the degree of relatedness of that sequence of the epitope. So this can be very useful to determine degrees of relatedness. It's also fantastic for scientific applications because we're able to stick glowing particles known as fluorophores onto antibodies and have them tag proteins in our research. So it's very useful for us. So today's activities. So take a look at your lab manual, examine the timescale table, read it and start learning about the different events that happened, and take a look at the figures that are in your lab manual. This is the Evidences of Evolution chapter. And I've also included a link online to look at fossils in the Smithsonian Paleobiology collection. So we don't have the fossil samples that we would have looked at in class, but you're able to look through their curated collection. Or if you want, there's a search feature, and you can look for any kind of fossil you might want to look at that they might have. So as always, if you have any questions, please email me or come to office hours on Fridays on Zoom 1 to 2, and have a pleasant weekend. All right. Bye, everybody.